Good morning. Good morning to Van Jackson. Good afternoon to the rest of us. Welcome to the Quincy Institute's book discussion on the Rivalry Peril, how great power competition threatens peace and weakens democracy. My name is Jake Werner. I'm the director of the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute. Quincy is a transpartisan think tank promoting ideas that move foreign policy and national security policy away from global domination, away from militarism, towards more diplomacy and productive engagement with the United States and the rest of the world. Now, we're here today with the authors of this wonderful new book, Van Jackson and Michael Brenes. This book focuses especially on the U.S.-China relationship. This is a core concern in the issue of U.S. foreign policy and its future path, whether its future path will be militaristic or not. U.S.-China relationship has been, you might not know this from recent debates and discussions, but the U.S.-China relationship has been the single most important concern for the U.S. foreign policy establishment for at least the last decade. That is sometimes hard to see because of the foreign policy crises that we've been facing in recent years, whether that's the Russian attack on Ukraine or Israel's various wars in the Middle East under Biden, or the narrowly averted wars against North Korea and Iran that we nearly had in the first Trump term. But throughout this entire period, China has loomed large in U.S. foreign policy considerations because it's the only near-peer competitor to U.S. in military and economic power. And U.S. foreign policy establishment has been obsessed with figuring out how to respond to it. U.S. foreign policy establishment has also been obsessed with figuring out how to move beyond the disasters of the war on terror. And U.S.-China competition, so-called competition, has been a key tactic in working past, or maybe avoiding working past, the war on terror. So this book is timely. It reviews the recent history of U.S.-China tensions. It lays out a path to avoid open conflict. It does not touch upon the new Trump administration, but we will be doing that today. So I'd like to welcome my two guests today. Van Jackson is a senior lecturer in international relations at Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. Michael Brenes is co-director of the Brady-Johnson Program in Grand Strategy and a lecturer in history at Yale University. Both of them are senior non-resident fellows at the Center for International Policy. Thank you very much, Van and Michael, for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
So I want to jump right into the book. The way that you begin the argument is to review the history of the Cold War, the 20th century Cold War, U.S.-Soviet Union rivalry, and evaluate that history on its own terms, and then also try to give us a framework for thinking about the ways in which U.S.-China competition fall into that framework, the ways in which they don't, and what kinds of lessons that should give us. So I want to start the conversation there. First, Michael, could you just tell us your own evaluation of the Cold War, the historical Cold War? There's a lot of sort of romanticization of this history in DC. I myself kind of came to political awareness at the very, very tail end of this in the late 90s, when there were still fresh memories of American finance death squads in Central America from the Second Cold War under Reagan. So some of this is within my own historical memory, but that historical memory seems to have vacated those who are old enough in DC to have lived through it, and those who are a bit younger might not be aware of this. So could you just give us a sense of the actual experience of the Cold War rather than the kind of romanticized memory of it that dominates in DC?
Sure. Well, thanks again, Jake, and thanks again to Quincy for having us. So I, as you alluded to, I think the Cold War first was, for most people, certainly scholars, historians, was incredibly violent. I think the memory of the Cold War in DC is that it was a long peace, and that the Cold War led to the fall of the Soviet Union, and prosperity and democracy followed, at least for 2 decades after that. But the Cold War for most, again, historians, and I think for I think many people who even open a book on the Cold War realize that the Cold War obviously led to bloody coups. It led to guerrilla wars. It led to large-scale conflicts, whether that be in Vietnam and Afghanistan. It destabilized many parts of the global South, the effects of which we're dealing with today, whether we're talking about Africa or Latin America or Asia. There's been some very good scholarship done just on how the Cold War wreaked havoc in Asia by Paul Thomas Chamberlain. He wrote a great book called The Cold War Killing Fields, which is looking at the violence of the Cold War. But I raised this point and re-raised this point in the book just to emphasize that if policymakers are thinking about whether we're in a new Cold War with China or we're in some sort of dynamic or framework of competition that is equivalent to the Cold War, we should think about how the United States and the United States' pursuit of primacy during the Cold War destabilized the global South in ways that created the deaths of millions of people, and that led to, again, some enduring problems that we are dealing with today. And you can express that in terms of blowback, or you can express that in other forms. But I think that also has to be part of the calculus in terms of whether competition is good or not, or whether we can actually win a Cold War, if we are in a Cold War, win a competition with China going forward over the next 10, 20, 30, maybe even 40, 50 years.
Thanks, Michael. Just before the next question, just want to remind the audience we welcome questions from the audience. We'll get to those towards the end of our discussion. So if anything pops up, just throw it in the Q&A at any point during the discussion, and we'll come back and pose some of those to Van and Michael at the end. Van, I wanna turn to you, ask you. How do you think about the differences between the historical Cold War and the U.S.-China conflict that we're experiencing now? There have been a number of people who have drawn this comparison. It's obviously animating thinking in DC to a certain extent. And yet every time someone raises this thing, we hear there's almost like a rote formula that everyone has to append to this, that today China is more powerful than the Soviet Union. The US and China are more entangled with each other economically. And that kind of qualification never really seems to translate into any consideration of how things might be done differently, other than to say that it's just different. So when you're thinking about the state of US-China relations today, to what extent is that Cold War analogy applicable? And to what extent do you see that analogy driving behavior in DC right now?
Yeah, the concern that we have, and that really that animated the book in the first place, like the reason Mike and I had a mind meld about this that was sufficient to put pen to paper, was really that like the way that the Cold War is remembered in the minds of policymakers, or the way that it's invoked, is as this like romantic necessary struggle. It's something very different from what Mike outlined, right? And so the Cold War analogy, that to understand what the Cold War really was, would be like a negative prescription. Like, this is precisely what we should be trying to avoid, because the Cold War ultimately was this global regime of violence, hierarchy, exclusion at the price of many, many lives, right? And if that's what it was, we should be trying to avoid it. The fact that we're trying to replicate it with a blind spot on how bad it was is just like catastrophe waiting to happen, or it's catastrophe that's like building in real time, So the idea that like, this is not a cold. I mean, like Marco Rubio, before he was appointed Secretary of State, he was like, this is not a Cold War with China. This is worse than a Cold War with China, because they're bigger, because they're holding our debt and manipulating their currency or whatever. And so like, objectively, there really is not a lot that's common with the Cold War, if you want to use the analogy as a guide to policy, like a positive guide to policy, because China occupies a totally different position in the capitalist world system, right? China's domestic issues or like even the structure, the composition of its domestic politics is just different from the Soviet Union. Its geopolitical ambitions are way more like modest than the Soviet Union, you know? But US foreign policy, of course, assumes the opposite. The China threat industry assumes the opposite, you know? And so when the Cold War gets invoked as a prescription, as a like, this is should be our mental map, it's to justify arms racing, it's to justify jingoism, it's to justify extremism of every variety, you know? And that's who benefits from that? Who's that good for? Because it's not good for most of us.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable point is that the foreign policy establishment wants the stuff that they like about the Cold War in this. At the same time, they say they don't want a Cold War. I mean, one of the things the Biden administration said very clearly is we don't want a new Cold War. We don't want rival geopolitical blocs. But they certainly did want the things about the Cold War that they liked, right? Like they wanted to have an enemy that would unify the American population under their leadership, that would give the nation purpose, that would allow them to revive the American economy, would allow them to overcome populism. There were all of these kinds of scattered reasons that were compelling for different parts of the coalition, but they all thought they saw something they liked in the Cold War. We'll come back to whether that understanding of the Cold War has any hope of succeeding in today's America, because most of the book is a critique of those sort of half-formed fantasies, maybe is the best way of talking about them. But first, I want to talk about how we got into this kind of a position where we have the two most powerful countries in the world facing off against each other. So can you, Michael, could you talk a little bit about how you see the origins of this conflict? How did American leaders come to see China as a very serious threat, if not the most serious threat facing American national security?
Well, as we write in the book, I mean, the end of the Cold War created this moment where we actually didn't think we would be here. The Clinton administration, I mean, the Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, and the Clinton administration welcomed, really up until the Obama administration, welcomed China's growth, certainly economic growth, thinking that, of course, this would lead to the liberalization of the CCP and their overall the Chinese state. And so from basically the 1990s up until around 2015, 2016, even during the pivot to Asia, so-called pivot to Asia in 2011, with Hillary Clinton's Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's article in Foreign Policy that announced the pivot to Asia, there really was a sense that we could cooperate with China. Or that China's rise is a good thing, which is this is what Clinton said. This is really what Bush said, and even Obama said. We don't want to antagonize China. China's a valuable economic partner, and we encourage China's growth. We encourage China's rise by outsourcing our industry, by relying upon Chinese exports, cheap Chinese exports into the United States. What things start to change is when I think two things happen. One is that the war on terror goes very poorly, as you kind of alluded to in your opening remarks. And this was a losing game for Washington, I think, very clearly on by, I mean, I'd say trying to pursue the defeat of terrorism as a concept is a losing game, but certainly by 2010, by 2011, the Iraq War and the Afghanistan war. I mean, the Iraq war is obviously a disaster. The war in Afghanistan was not going to be better than what it was. There was a sense among policymakers that there needs to be a new concern. I think, where do we go here from here? And you have China, who's now at this point exerting a greater influence on the world stage, thinking about cooperation again in the terms that I discussed earlier. But then Xi Jinping comes to power by 2012, 2013. And Xi's bellicosity, his more aggressive nationalistic posture, and at least from the Americans' perspective, in terms of like him representing a more even more authoritarian leadership style. And then the Belt and Road Initiative coming after that, subsequent to that, it looks like from American policymakers' perspective that China is not an actor who we can cooperate with anymore. that this is actually going to be a competitor, and we have to shift to strategic competition, which was a phrase that started to come out in the Obama administration within the Department of Defense. Ash Carter used it, and then people within the Obama administration said, "Don't use that. Actually, we don't want it. We don't want that to be how we characterize things." But of course, when Trump won in 2016, he and his administration ran with it and thought that China, I mean, the Trump administration welcomed a bunch of China hawks into its administration. They all thought that China was the premier existential threat to American national security, and they reorganized or tried to reorganize American foreign policy around the China threat. And they did so in ways that we are familiar with now, with export controls, tariffs, trying to, as Van said earlier, out arms race, out technology race China. And the Biden administration ran with those things when the Biden administration came to power in 2021. You have many of the policies that Trump pursued towards China being carried out and expanded upon. And with the added rhetoric that Biden put on this was that this is a war between autocracy and democracy, that this is a conflict that China will quote unquote eat our lunch. And then organizing foreign policy and domestic policy, which we can get into, around the China threat. That as you said, this would be an effort to rebuild our economy, to get out of COVID, to revitalize our democracy. But as we say in the book, and I'll end with this point, obviously these things have not come to fruition. The shift to strategic competition away from cooperation has actually not achieved greater ends for the United States. It has not achieved greater stability abroad. It has not achieved greater prosperity for Americans at home. Yes, some jobs are going to be created from China rivalry in terms of the CHIPS Act, in terms of the IRA, but it's not a program that ultimately can beat back the forces of austerity and nationalism and xenophobia that we see rising and thriving in the United States and globally at the moment.
One thing worth. Oh, sorry.
Well, I want to come back to that, to the arguments you make in the book about the actual effects of the practice of great power competition. But before we do that, I want to just dig in because Michael, you gave us a great overview of this trajectory from an Obama administration that was trying to hedge against rising Chinese power, but saw a real possibility of cooperation and a real plus side to Chinese success, to very rapidly to the position under the Biden administration. Of course, many people in the Biden administration are alums of the Obama administration. So we're talking about some of the same people who once had a very different view here. By the Biden administration, just takes a very strong hostility towards China that you get in the first Trump administration and confirms that, institutionalizes it. So I want to dig in just a little bit on some of these points to try to draw out analytically like what we think happened here. To start with, and Van, maybe you can address this. To what extent do you think that the kind of intensification of authoritarianism within China, which really started before Xi Jinping took over, but Xi Jinping really intensified it. You have increasing authoritarianism, increasingly repressive orientation of the government towards the population. You have the crushing of democracy protests in Hong Kong by 2019. You have the really horrific coercive assimilation campaign against the Uyghurs in Western China, starting in 2016, 2017, around there. So China is changing in this period, right? And when American leaders talk about the reasons that they have become antagonistic towards China, they often cite these things. To what extent? But on the other hand, of course, these same people are very happy to cooperate extensively and deeply with dictators in previously in places like Pakistan, or forever, literally forever, in Saudi Arabia. Like there's no compunction about dealing with supporting dictators under the right circumstances. So what extent do you think that these kinds of ideological claims about authoritarianism and democracy are actually motivating the shift in policy?
They're motives, but they're motives of convenience for the reasons you point out, right? Like the comparative lens on our comfort with authoritarianism suggests that there's something else going on than just Xi Jinping tyranny that motivates us to act. And what we try to explain in the book is that like there's a structural way of understanding this on multiple levels, so like on one aspect of that is that like the national security state itself is optimized. It's designed for great power competition, right? The National Security Act in the Truman years, like it's supposed to confront a monolithic other with a competing sort of, ideological orientation or whatever. And so they're looking for that big bad. And it's worth mentioning, just adding to Mike's explanation, the Office of Net Assessment in the Pentagon, as early as like basically the first Taiwan Strait crisis in the 90s, that moment started a China threat cottage industry, basically, that was tied narrowly to the Pentagon. And like some scholars in strategic studies who were kind of like proactively imagining the China great power threat way before it was in material existence, right? And what happened over, and so they became a constituency to advocate for quote unquote balancing against China militarily within a larger foreign policy that was premised on the strategic détente, where we're basically working with China diplomatically or whatever, but then in the bowels of the Pentagon, we're doing all this like secret war planning and playing the geopolitical balancing game, right? That view of China just takes on more and more prominence over time for all the reasons that like Mike was kind of explaining. But so the national security state is primed to respond this way, and Xi Jinping turning toward harder authoritarianism is makes that fit. The thing that's like kind of missing that we do spend a bunch of time on in the book is the understanding of great power rivalry itself as inter-imperial rivalry. So as the dividends of, and you've written about this, so like we actually, I think, cite you somewhere, but as the dividends of neoliberal globalization have kind of shrunk and global growth has stagnated, China and the US have both turned to, economic nationalism, one-upmanship, the national securitization of everything, And there is a degree of mirror imaging there. Like both great powers are exploiting the advantages afforded by their favorable positions in the world system to claim a larger share of a shrinking economic pie, And so you get economic nationalism, you get tariff barriers and such. And those are expressions of state power to secure the bag for special interests that fall within your nation. And that is, of course, like a dead end for reasons we can talk about. But like that's kind of what's happening. They're mobilizing state power, and geopolitical competition becomes the like justification framework for it, basically. Um,
Yeah, thanks. That I think that's really helpful. Obviously, one of the things that emerged pretty strongly under Obama, but that Trump just ratcheted up 100 times was the sense of China as an economic threat,
mhm,
and usually was on the claim that China was cheating, was breaking the rules, was competing unfairly, was stealing our stuff, stealing our jobs, stealing our technology. And for that reason, then we have to confront China. So this economic dimension of the conflict, which was by far the most important sort of popular facet of it, right? Like man, you're just talking about what's going on in the Pentagon. There's not that big of a popular constituency for for advanced war planning and for protecting or making sure that Taiwan doesn't fall under Chinese control. But there is a big constituency of people who are trying to understand why the economy seemed to be turning so bad for them after 2008.
mhm.
So that really, I think, helps make sense of why this became a bipartisan project. But I'll come back to you, Michael. I agree that there is really strong continuity between the first Trump term and the Biden administration on many of these questions, sort of the framework for analyzing them, the sense that this is a domestic political imperative as well as a foreign policy imperative. But do you see any consequential differences? Was there something that changed under Biden that was important?
I think and I alluded to this in my earlier remarks, I think what fundamentally changed was that uh, under Biden and Biden administration officials thought that rivalry could be uh, good for American democracy and economic growth. and revitalizing again domestic problems that the United States had for decades, but really COVID and other crises had exposed. I mean, going back to the 2008 financial crisis, right, and the ways that neoliberalism wasn't working for Americans and globally for people around the world. I thought that Trump didn't really care about that. He didn't really, think about foreign policy as an opportunity to revitalize anything. It was sort of going after China because, as you said, it was a an existential threat, and there was already, as Van said, a cottage industry of people who had been reared in this and thought that actually they can make an impact on sort of the national security apparatus. But I think what Biden administration officials felt that this, the post-COVID moment aligned with the China rivalry situation was an opportunity to kind of implement their vision for foreign policy for a middle class to a certain extent. And you could have the IRA, or it wasn't the IRA that initially was a vision, but infrastructure spending, technology spending, these can be revitalize manufacturing or bring jobs to Americans, and also could beat back China's developments and its growth in climate and technology. And we can talk about why we're in a climate race with China, which is kind of absurd considering how how climate change is going to affect China and the United States and people around the world on equal terms, maybe not, but it will still affect people. But having a kind of a climate race and a technology race with China was, I think, and this goes back to the Cold War framing, was kind of a way to get all the best aspects of the Cold War without having the consequences potentially as they saw. And you could have competition without catastrophe, to quote a title of a article that came out in 2019 from Jake Sullivan and Kirk Campbell. So I think that was a clear difference. And then I think the analysis though is then, was that effective? Did rivalry actually do those things? And I think you can point to the 2024 election and just say, no, it didn't. I mean, it didn't heal our politics. It didn't bring jobs on a mass scale that could provide people a sense of comfort and a sense of prosperity, or let alone prosperity, but sense of things were getting better. And that means ultimately that goes back to our original analysis in the book, which is that if you look at great power competition during the Cold War, yes, jobs were created, suburbanization happens, racial equality. The Cold War helped to ameliorate some aspects of racial inequality and dealing with those things. But overall, as a net positive thing for Americans and for social movements and for democracy, I think it's clear that it wasn't actually the boon to the United States and to Americans and people around the world, and certainly in the ways that many officials wanted or hoped. And so I think that's the distinction, but in the end, you're still back into like rivalry for the sake of rivalry kind of framework, which is where we'll see where that goes under Trump 2.0. But I think we're going to see aspects of this great power competition framework, materialize in various ways over the next 4 years.
Yeah, thank you. Just on that theme of democracy versus authoritarianism, which was very strongly articulated, at least at the beginning of the Biden administration. And was they kind of highlighted this with a series of summits for democracy. The one in 2023, the opening speakers at the Summit for Democracy were Benjamin Netanyahu, Giorgia Meloni, and Narendra Modi. So 3 of the highlights of democracy in the world today. But people, so obviously illiberal elected leaders who are in the process of eroding/destroying democracy in their countries, but who happen to be geopolitically important for the project of limiting Chinese power. I mean, I think that kind of, or the following Summit for Democracy was presided over in Seoul by Yoon Suk-yeol, the president of South Korea.
You can't make this up. You can't make this up.
The current president of South Korea, who has been relieved of his duties for trying to establish a dictatorship. So I don't know, the hypocrisy kind of American geopolitics in the name of democracy sort of speaks for itself. But I want to kind of drill in a little bit more on what Michael brought up, Van, and how this affects American democracy. So obviously there's sort of a process of discrediting the idea of democracy internationally when we pursue geopolitical conflict in the name of democracy and sort of sacrifice democratic principles to that pursuit. But there you also make a strong argument that this has very serious effects on American democracy. Can you kind of bring out that analysis? Where do you see what's the mechanism by which great power conflict can undermine democracy in the United States?
Yeah, we have two separate chapters on how geopolitical rivalry threatens and erodes political democracy and then economic democracy, or like worsens economic inequality. Our phrasing of that is economic democracy. But the political democracy erosion really takes the form of like heightening and legitimizing and creating a permissive space for far right extremist conspiracy takes, basically, where it's like China's the boogeyman hiding under our bed, and it's completely legitimate to think that and believe that, because for some reason we let our intelligence officials talk to the public as if they're not going to be propagandists on behalf of the national security state, as if the CIA director is a serious person when he's writing an op-ed in the New York Times. It's like, are you kidding me? Like, why is this guy on the Sunday shows? And like, so they're selling us fear, and that creates an environment that lets all the new version of the John Birch Society psychos come out of the woodwork to claim that, like, communist China, which, by the way, it's only since great power rivalry onset began that the communist part of the CCP has become like really capitalized and emphasized in all the talking points. Now it's like communist China, you know. It's like the seedbed of Dr. Strangelove, like that whole nuclear machinations of like what that movie was. It started with like Air Force colonel who was basically a Bircher, like a John Birch guy who believed that the communists were like poisoning or like brainwashing us through our water supply, and it was a total psycho conspiracy theory thing, but it's the Cold War rivalry framework that gives him that permissive space. And then he becomes a true believer, and then he acts, and then we end up in nuclear war. You know what I mean? So like the political democracy erosion thing has everything to do with amplifying the far right, but also political opposition, as in the Trump campaign itself, Republican senatorial campaigns. They use the China threat as a wedge to say that their opponents are too soft on China, too weak on China. Beijing, Biden, that was like a real talking point, right? And so this is not the threat that brings us together. It's the threat that is used as a political wedge in domestic politics, separate from the far rightization of American politics. The economic democracy thing to me is way more interesting because the political stuff is obvious to me. The economic inequality problem is way less obvious to people. So like, think about this. The interest alone on US financing for the first like 18 years of the war on terror was $925 billion. That's not what we spent on the war on terror. That's what we spent on financing the war on terror. So that's debt servicing money, not job creation, not wages, not welfare, just paying the interest on the credit card. You know what I mean? And the job multiplier effect from federal spending on the military, 6.9 jobs in the defense industry for every $1 million that's spent on average. That's lower than the job multiplier effect in any other industry where federal dollars are spent, including education and healthcare. So as a way of like supporting the economy or stimulating the economy, it's terrible. Like pouring money into geopolitical rivalry benefits the guy who makes the F-22. It doesn't benefit workers. You know what I mean? And military spending in general, especially for high-tech warfare, which is the China imaginary for Washington, military spending is capital intensive. It's not manpower intensive. And so the money that you pour in, it buys stuff, it buys platforms. It doesn't buy jobs efficiently, right? And so some people would point to like the Korean War as this model for doing military Keynesianism, where you spend on defense to boost the economy. But the Korean War and the military buildup that was involved with it took place at a time when inequality in the US was at a historic low, when the labor movement was at a historic high and very militant, and when tax rates were super high, and we didn't put that war on the credit card. We paid it through taxation. And so none of those conditions are present today. So it's like you could think that you could bet that like stoking China rivalry or leaning into it is some kind of solution to economic inequality, or like that's how we're going to get to a better common good economically. We'll be more economically secure, the average worker, if we just hyper focus on China rivalry. And you might even point to the Korean War, where it's like there was a Korean post-Korean War boom in the economy, but it's like all the conditions that made that boom possible don't exist. Now we have this kind of uh, lecherous oligarchic class that captures all the value from everything that we do and everything we spend money on. We don't have a strong labor movement to defend wages and to demand better conditions. So all of that, those are things that are required for federal spending to actually benefit average people. And we don't have those conditions. So when the federal government is spending money on this stuff, it's just going into defense contractor pockets.
Yeah, yes. And I think you made a really important point in the book that sort of, on the same argument, the first Cold War was preceded by a dramatic victory for organized labor
Mm.
during the 30s that was then in many ways generalized, even as it was somewhat circumscribed during World War II, and then further circumscribed in the early Cold War period. But still, the basis of the Cold War was that labor unions were strong, and that was the grounds on which you could have broad distribution of the gains from military Keynesianism. We certainly don't have those conditions now. So this is another, I think, very consequential difference with the Cold War. Just
Mhm.
the political economy necessarily will be quite different. But sort of going off of that point you raised about the oligarchy that now reigns over us in a very direct way. Let's talk about the second Trump administration. Michael, what do you see as, do you see the direction on China, which remains somewhat indistinct, but are you expecting the direction on China to be basically on the same trajectory that we got from the first Trump administration through the Biden administration? Or are we seeing a break here? There seems to be a break from the second Trump administration seems to be quite different than the first in a range of different ways.
Yeah.
How are you thinking about where the U.S.-China conflict goes? Or is this something that Trump himself has talked about? He wants to make a deal with Xi Jinping. He does not seem bothered by all these ideological complaints. He certainly is not bothered by democracy. He's also less concerned, significantly less concerned than the Biden administration about the kind of strategic position within supply chains and the question
Yep.
of dominating the so-called technologies of the future. So Trump himself is that doesn't speak for everyone in his administration, but how do you see the second Trump administration moving forward on China?
I see aspects of, I mean, certainly we don't see the great power competition or the framework of great power competition that we saw under Biden, under Trump 2.0. I mean, that's, the idea that great power competition is going to revitalize democracy and create jobs, and, you know, Trump's cutting jobs. He's eliminating a lot of the subsidies that came, or trying to eliminate a lot of subsidies to companies that came with the IRA and things like that. But Trump is using economic tools to coerce outcomes, from the Chinese state. He's using tariffs, which is not a great weapon to use to create the outcomes he wants. But yeah, he's trying to use tariffs to force um, decisions to be made in China that will be beneficial to him. Again, I think that's not going to happen through tariffs or through other types of coercive means. He has also, I think, institutionally stacked his administration within the DoD with the, and I think, Van has talked about this too with China hawks. I mean, Marco Rubio is a thorough, I mean, he's China hawk. Mike Walls and Pete Hegseth, if you listen to the statements that they made about the future of the Pentagon and defense budget, and yes, there's talk of cutting it by 8%, or Trump saying he's going to cut it by 50%. But why are they getting rid of DEI, or why are they getting rid of these programs? Is because we have to focus on the China threat. Everything must be prioritized to deal with China, because it's again an existential threat to democracy, international security, etc. So I think we'll see elements of this, of great power competition that we've seen over the past 10 years reflected in the Trump administration. If Trump does decide to pursue a grand bargain, though, with Xi and on Taiwan or other issues, I think, though, we shouldn't be determining that that's actually the future, because it seems Trump is if nothing else, he's unpredictable, right? He is thoroughly unpredictable. So what is good for Trump tomorrow might not be good for Trump next week. So if he gets a bargain that he thinks is going to be great for the United States, and it turns out something happens, or personally between he and Xi, or he doesn't get the things he wants, then maybe he'll just go back on the deal, or maybe so instability domestically, certainly that's what we're seeing now. It's affecting all sorts of things, domestically. I think instability in foreign policy will also be the norm going forward. And I think China is going to be part of that. What the constant will be, and I'll turn things over to Van, and to you, Jake, but the constant will be that they're going to try to coerce China to change its behavior, to make sure that America still has primacy and dominance over, East Asia in the ways that it saw it and wanted, going back to the Cold War. And I think the effects of that, though, will be limited given the nature of the system we're in, where it's, increasingly multipolar, and China has a greater economic stake over and military stake over things in ways that they didn't, right, 20, 30 years ago. So I'll stop there.
Okay. I want to start with some audience questions now. Anyone else who has questions out there in the audience, please continue adding them to the Q&A. But Nancy Goldner asks, what would be the opposing progressive political and economic strategy to counter the framing of China as the threat? So Van, this is you have, I think, a lot of very helpful points in the book about what the alternative would be, both kind of the U.S. orientation towards China, as well as what the U.S. should actually be fighting for in terms of reforming the global system. Can you give us kind of an overview of your thinking there?
Yeah, I mean, the short version, the concluding chapter, we have a whole bunch of recommendations and sort of principles for how to, do a sane foreign policy. But the short version is that, like, we need a new détente with China, like we established in the 70s, but we can do it better. It doesn't have to be elitist and secretive and necessarily sacrificial of others, right? We can have this modus vivendi where we actually decide for strategic reasons that it's in our interests to cooperatively coexist, not even competitively coexist, cooperatively coexist, right? The key to that, and that would be hugely stabilizing. That would create the most secure outcome for Taiwan, frankly, right? But you have to have a material basis for that. What is the material basis of a new détente? So the thing we try to pitch in the book is like, yes, you need military restraint. Yes, arms racing would lead you nowhere. And yes, if you show military restraint and can end up in this sort of reciprocal military restraint regime of some kind, that increases confidence in the ability to sort of work together. But work together on what? You know what I mean? And our pitch in the book was to work together to help the global South accelerate their green transition in a world of climate crisis, and to make them help them become fiscally solvent, because most of the global South is like in this perpetual sovereign debt crisis, which really suffocates the ability for national governments to do public spending. And it's that public spending and investment that you need to grow, right? So instead of doing all the stuff that we've done, we ought to be working with China to restructure and forgive sovereign debt and to facilitate, not to constrain, China's green tech production or overproduction, which is cheap and effective, and like route that stuff to the global south as a way, not try to block it, as a way to facilitate the green transition, you know? And all of that is totally feasible and not crazy, but it does require a framework basically of like real cooperation with China. In a great power competition framework, you cannot even entertain any of these things that we're suggesting, you know? And so that's why there has to be a kind of like mindset shift.
Yeah, thank you. I really agree with that. Argument I've been making for a long time is that faster, higher quality growth, more egalitarian growth in the global south would open up a lot of space in the global economy so that the US and China didn't feel like they were stuck in a zero-sum competition for a limited amount of growth that's available, which I think ends up driving a lot of the sense of threat on the other side. If there were simply more opportunities, I think a lot of the animosities that come from scarcity get resolved when you have more opportunities, and the biggest potential opportunity out there is just for the world's impoverished minority to be, or majority, to become to have higher productivity and to become consumers for the first time. So yeah, I think that is very important. Can we talk a little bit more about this question of the global political economy that is involved here? Because I think you have a very incisive critique of the Biden approach on this. So Jake Sullivan, he really eulogized neoliberal globalization. He said, it's gone, we're doing something different now. Neoliberal globalization was a vision for the world economy that in principle could include everyone. Now, there were tensions within the system that made that impossible in practice, but in principle, it was inclusive. And that was the basis on which we had great power peace between the US and China and other major powers up until the 2010s. Did Biden have a vision like that for what the global economy should look like? And if so, how do you think it fell short? Michael, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I think Sullivan first should be praised for offering that eulogy, to say neoliberalism is dead. Whether we're in a post neoliberal moment or not, we can debate that, but that's a good thing. I think though, if you read the transcript of the Brookings speech that he made, I think it's 2023 speech, it's basically the United States needs to take the lead and be at the forefront of leading the world into prosperity. So we're back to kind of like a 1950s, 60s model of like sort of growth through American ingenuity, and the Biden administration, through the CHIPS Act, through the IRA, through infrastructure, is actually creating opportunities in ways that accelerate growth. There was some points about we can't constrain China everywhere, but in the end, the overall message of the speech was the United States needs to be at the forefront of leading the world into prosperity to constrain China. And that's the major takeaway of it. Like the post neoliberal order is one that where it's going to be defined by great power competition. And what we said, as Van articulated, is that in an era where it's increasingly multipolar, world economically, certainly, it's better for the United States and China, and working with China, to figure out ways that, or certainly from the United States perspective, can use American primacy for the tools of greater egalitarian growth. To your point, and so that includes getting a strategy to deal with sovereign debt. It means expediting the production of climate technology in ways that further the interests of workers, not exploits them. And I think it also means that we don't have to force countries in the global south to choose between China or the United States. We're kind of back in this framework of either you're with us or against us kind of thing. And I think having an economy that's more egalitarian, that enfranchises workers, within their nation doesn't have to be this sort of zero sum thing, either, you're with us or against us kind of thing, but it actually leads to greater growth, which leads to, I think greater stability and prosperity overall. But I don't know if you want to throw it over to Van too for his thoughts as well, but that's just my nascent thoughts.
Let me ask Van something different because we are kind of running short on time, and I think this is maybe the most urgent question is just I agree with a lot of your prescriptions, but they just seem completely hopeless right now.
Yeah,
This is not
pretty much.
the approach the Trump administration is going to take. China's response to both the Biden and to the new Trump administration is not to articulate a new vision of rapid inclusive growth for the entire world. So it doesn't seem to be coming from China either. What exactly, kind of like, given where we're at right now, both in US politics and in the state of the global system, and everyone sort of feeling increasingly insecure, so increasingly less likely to trust the other powers with which they would have to cooperate if we were to pursue this alternate approach to the world system and to great power politics. Given where we're at right now, what can you give us any hope, or in the absence of any hope, then what should we be doing to sort of create the possibility of hope?
We're in trouble, dude. We're in big trouble. I mean, everything we're doing in foreign policy and in domestic policy is accelerating American decline, and that, I mean, historically, when you have a great power declining like we are, bad stuff happens. And so, like, I'm not like, China is not the urgent threat. We are the urgent threat. I don't know how can you think any differently at this point? Like, we end the concluding chapter with an epigraph from Eric Hobsbawm. And I should write down the quote for these talks. I keep forgetting it, but it's like he was writing in the George Bush years, and he was like, the most urgent task for the world is to restore rationality to American foreign policy. And that remains the same urgent demand now, even more so than ever, even more than during the war on terror early years. So, like, the thing that, this is not a source of hope, but the thing to maybe that's worthwhile to pour our energies in is to agitate for the Trump administration to live up to Trump's rhetoric about, he says he wants to cut the defense budget by half. Let's do it. Let's go. It's not happening. That's a lie. They're not cutting it at all. It's going to eclipse $1 trillion in the next 12 months, guaranteed. But that's what he says. He says he wants to cut it by half. Let's go. He wants to do trilateral arms control with Russia and China. He also said that. Let's go. You know what I mean? If he wants to free Greenland, quote unquote, how about freeing Guam and American Samoa and, CNMI? Modern day colonies that are being denied self-determination. Let's go. So, like, there's a path here that if Trump's most ambitious visionary peace rhetoric were to actually be operationalized, we've got common cause. There's a lot to work with there, but that rhetoric has no expression within the national security state or anything that the Congress is doing. So the material reality is just very bleak.
Michael, do you want to comment on that? Where you see opportunities, or what exactly we should be doing in this moment?
Ditto. I mean, it's hard not to get despondent. I think that, I mean, to me, the challenge right now for any progressive foreign policy thinker, anyone who's thinking about not just how do we deal with the status quo, but how we build a better future, I think is not becoming despondent and not becoming, not resigned to just sort of following the horrible things that Trump is doing. But what the case I'm making and the arguments I've been, actually, Van and I made in a foreign affairs piece when the book came out in January, was that now is the time in a era of overwhelming nationalism um, both at home and abroad, to really begin to think about an international vision of what comes next. Trump has hopefully has just 4 more years. Hopefully something comes better, something emerges out of this and is better after the 4 years. And I think it's the challenge for progressive foreign policy thinkers or people interested in a better world, to prevent the kinds of declines that Van is talking about, to think about the ways in which American power and the great powers, or America and its allies, can actually be returned to sort of an internationalist vision, or create an internationalist vision that would actually tackle the true existential crises that we're facing, i.e. climate. I think the climate change, as we say in the book, is a very visible and clear threat to security, not just national security, but domestic, economic, political security. And I think now is the time to start building something, so when there is there are better political conditions that emerge, or there's a better or more amenable administration, maybe we can offer it and show how creative thinking is necessary and needed for ways in which we get out, or a method to get out of this mess that we're rapidly descending into.
We just got a couple minutes left. I just want to kind of bring together a couple of the questions from the audience. A number of people are asking about the role of other countries in all of this. What role can Europe play? What role can the BRICS countries play? What about U.S. allies in the region? I'll give you the last word here, Van. Do you see possibilities for other countries kind of moving this in the right direction, or if not in the short term, at least sort of like structuring a framework that a future American administration might be able to step into and really take advantage of?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say is hegemonic orders are historically rare, and we are just coming out of an era where we were in one, where we spent most of our lives in one. And so a lot of even smart people's thinking about this stuff is very distorted, or it's biased, or it's a recency bias in a sense, you know? And so the most likely outcome, given what I just said, is that no great power, no single power is going to dominate the world and dominate global order. That is an aberration. We're coming out of that now. And the most likely thing is a political order in the context of global multipolarity, right? What will that political ordering be? It's not looking great. It's looking like repressive forms of ethno-nationalism, sort of, and that's one version of multipolarity. It's a very non-liberatory multipolarity. That's what appears to be emerging, and that's what U.S. foreign policy seems to be supporting. But it's conceivable that if other powers in the world system act in a collective way, we can have something different. In the Cold War, there was an attempt, the third world itself was supposed to be a third world. It was neither the Soviet sphere or the US sphere, right? There was an ambition there. There was a world, alternative future, the new international economic order. There's talks of that happening now, the non-aligned movement, right? These are all well springs for future configurations of global order that are positive, that work within multipolarity, that are open rather than exclusionary, that decenter the great powers. That's totally conceivable, but it really depends on collective action by smaller powers. So the BRICS, like, it's good to work with China, but if you're just you don't want to be a Chinese sphere of influence. You know what I mean? So you don't need to antagonize the US. If you're Europe, it's the same thing. You want to work with the US, you don't want to be a US sphere. So like smaller powers in the world system need to find that non-aligned energy, and like that's the most likely alternative to a world of just, ethno-nationalisms and civilizational empire under multipolarity, which is kind of like what we're drifting into.
Yes, I think that is a wonderful place to end, and really I think is a call for all of us to both to, like, many of us oppose American primacy, but if we go from American primacy as the form of global order to a vicious zero-sum ethno-nationalist multipolarity, that is not going to be any better. So we need to be, but I think I absolutely agree with what you're saying. We don't have the vision for what the alternative would look like, a sustainable and humane multipolarity. We don't have that vision right now. And certainly other powers are not organizing themselves along that line, along those lines. But thinkers in the United States are not really articulating that either. And so I think that's a call to all of us in the United States and outside the United States to be preparing the ground for something different in U.S.-China relations and for the world as a whole. Thank you very much, Van and Michael, for joining us. The book is The Rivalry Peril. It's out just a couple months ago from Yale University Press. I strongly encourage everyone to go out and buy it and read it. And join those of us at the Quincy Institute and like-minded locations in this project of coming up with a sustainable and humane multipolarity that we can move the world towards. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Quincy does have events almost every week. So the next one we have on the docket is an interview with a couple of war journalists. So war journalism from Vietnam to Gaza will be coming up on April 16th with Arnold Skip Isaacs Azmat Khan and Tom Shanker. That should be a very interesting discussion. And you can sign up for the Quincy Institute announcements list on our website, quincyinst.org, if you want to get future announcements. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and hope everyone has a good rest of the week.